You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. Today we have yet another unique show, one that's grim yet hopeful. It's about the Atlanta, Georgia murders of 8 people, 6 of them Asian American women, last week. We are going to devote the entire program to this atrocity, and it will consist of 2 distinct parts. First, I'm honored that my guests for today are 2 Asian American feminist leaders, and we're going to engage in a conversation without interruption, one that takes its time and takes as much time as it needs. So we might run a little long. And then there will be fighting words at the end of the program. I'll be joined by, full disclosure, my dear friend and colleague of many years, Helen Zia, author of Asian American Dreams, The Emergence of an American People, co-author with Wenho Lee of My Country versus Me, the first-hand account by the Los Alamos scientist falsely accused of being a spy. A Fulbright scholar and the former executive editor of Ms. Magazine, Helen's most recent blockbuster book is Last Boat Out of Shanghai, which is newly out in paperback. My other guest is Yeon Choimorrow, executive director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, that's NAPAWF, NAPAWF.org. Before working at NAPAWF, Yeon was the Director of Organizing at Interfaith Worker Justice, and prior to that she was a community organizer at the Asian American Institute. She's a first-generation immigrant who came to the U.S. to study political science and urban studies at Wheaton College, and she earned a master's degree from McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. She's a teaching elder, although young herself, in the Presbyterian Church, USA. I'm deeply grateful that in a week such as this past one, a week saturated in grief, they were willing to be here. So before we begin, we'll take a very short pre-break and then return with the uninterrupted conversation. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Dear Helen, old friend and sister, and new friend and sister, Yeon, welcome to Women's Media Center Live. It's quite wonderful to have you here.
Wonderful to be with you, Robin.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you hosting us.
Oh, I appreciate your being here. I know that life is very harried for you now, in particular. So we'll jump right in because we're going to devote as much time as we can to the show and to this subject. One of the things that's driving me crazy and that I'd really be grateful if you two addressed is the inability, apparently, to walk and chew gum at the same time is it must be either a hate crime because it must be racist, or if it's misogyny, that's not a hate crime, and besides which it couldn't possibly be both. When, in fact, there is nothing more to the point of the cathexis than anti-Asian American sexism and racism intertwined with women getting the worst of it. I think isn't it 68% of reported incidents of anti-Asian harassment and violence have been from women? And you people at NAPAWF, NAPAWF, have revealed that nearly half of AAPI women have been affected by this mix of sexism and racism in the past years. Isn't that your polling? Sung-Yeon?
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. We had just completed our commissioning, a polling of folks who voted in the presidential election, and half of the women expressed that they had experienced some kind of racialized, slur or harassment in public in the last 2 years.
Oh, God. Well, of course, Trump brought it to a fine point, a high point, and lifted the rock so everything crawled out from under it. But not that it hasn't been there all along. Helen, I've spent much of the last, 2 or 3 days in fury at the ignorance of Americans again. In a sense, not their fault. The media doesn't tell them, schools don't tell them, whatever. But this is hardly new. I mean, we can't just blame it on Trump, because some people will say it goes back to internment during World War II, but my God, it goes back to the 18th century. I mean, the Page Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act. And how do we make this clear to people so that they have some grasp of the enormous history, legislative and discriminatory and violent, against Asian Americans in this country?
Well, that's the question, because this mass killing in Atlanta has, I think, woken up a lot of people like, oh, Asian Americans, you really do experience racism. And of course, with this pandemic, Sung-Yeon, groups like NAPOF, and really so many groups and Asian Americans across the country have been talking about, shouting about the attacks that have begun in intensity 15 months ago. Yeah. I mean, as soon as the virus was identified, in China, and then the white supremacist in chief started, just continuing and beating like a drum, blaming everything in America on China. It's just everybody who looks Chinese, started feeling the impact. But as you said, it's not new. It didn't begin, in 2019. It goes back really to the first Asians in America. We can point to different incidents and the first federal law about barring people from entering the U.S. because they were, disease-ridden, depraved people were Chinese women.
Right.
And
exactly.
So this has been going on, and that Page Act in 1875 was in the middle of an ethnic cleansing, a driving out of all Asian people from America, violent massacres, lynchings, burnings of areas that Asian Americans, Chinese Americans predominantly then lived. And so what's happening now, Asian Americans, can only say, we've known about racism for a long time. Yeah. And women have known about the genderized, attacks, the sexualization and the demonization of Asian American women.
Right.
We've known this. This has been going on. And, now But right. So the hope is that this awakening, we're awake. Yeah. We hope that the awakening of other people involves something that goes beyond, a news cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you, Helen. I think one of the things that was most striking about, I did 25 interviews on Wednesday, right, the day after the shooting, for a lot of beat news reporters. And the number of reporters who are not Asian American or Asian American women who were appalled at my story of sexual harassment that was very specific to my ethnicity and my race. I would, by the end of the day, I was so tired. I was so tired and demoralized by how invisible I had been all this time. And they're all like, oh my God, that's horrible. I can't believe that you encountered these things on our streets, right? And I told them, I said, I'm sorry, NAPOP has been here for 25 years. telling these stories, trying to be heard, and now you're coming to me because 6 women of Asian descent are dead.
Yeah.
I'm really angry that this is what it took for our stories to be taken seriously, right? And so I am, it has been made so evidently clear to me that we as Asian American women and how we experience racism in this country, which is often in this hypersexualized way, has never occurred to people. I went on a radio show with, Jackson's daughter, and she was very gracious. Santita was very gracious and said, women of color are hypersexualized, and we understand what you're saying. We get what you're saying. And it was like so amazing to be talking to someone who wasn't like, oh my God, I cannot believe this is happening to you all the time, and we had no idea.
Yeah.
Was just so refreshing. And I'm really sad to say, like, in talking to reporters day in and day out since Wednesday, it took all the way to Saturday to have somebody finally recognize what I was through and not act so surprised about what I was going through.
I remember very early on in the pandemic, there was a group of Filipinas here in New York that I was working with, and still am for that matter, and they're nurses primarily, and emergency room nurses, highly skilled, and they, my God, day after day they were going in, risking their lives, coming out just wiped out with exhaustion, with fear that they were bringing the disease home to this is when PPEs were hardly available. This is, front line. And while some New Yorkers were banging pots and pans in support, they were, each of them, experiencing, once they were alone on the street without the pots and pans being banged in the support, experiencing harassment and you dirty, so forth,
Right.
and so, and one of them said she had stopped in the street and just burst out crying and said, I am saving your lives. I am saving your damn lives. And
Robin, not only are they saving lives, but Filipina nurses, of the nurses, essential worker nurses who have been saving everyone's lives, 1 out of 3 who have died is Filipina.
Yeah.
And that is a statistic that's been out there for, months now. And
Yes.
it's like, who, it was
anybody
like a blip.
listening?
Like, why aren't people outraged by this?
I mean, one thing is a media thing, which is that it's good that they're paying less attention to the shooter, to the killer, and they're paying more attention to the survivors and most primarily the victims. So we have their names, and we can follow the leadership of the Black movement in saying their names, and that's very important. But I also think it's really important if my colleagues in the media were, when they are talking about the killer, to identify him, to say over and over and over again that he is a white, male, heterosexual, fundamentalist, religionist, terrorist. White, male, heterosexual, terrorist. Because although even the FBI, which is hardly a radical feminist organization, even the FBI points out that that white supremacist terrorism in this country is the primary threat, and we know that they always practice on women first. Even though we know these two things, it still is not getting through. And I'm terribly afraid we don't know yet the identity or anything, in fact, about the Colorado shooter. But I'm afraid, because the name sounds conceivably like it could be an Arab name, that this will A, put South Asians in the crosshairs, and B, drive Atlanta completely out of the news cycle, because apparently these idiots can only handle one thing at a time. What do you folks think about that?
I just want to say that I want to reframe that conversation and say Boulder was the 7th mass shooting in 7 days in the United States.
Good work. Yeah.
We're only hearing about Atlanta and Boulder because they were deadly,
Right.
but there were 5 other shootings that happened in our country in the last 7 days. And so we need to really reframe what we're talking about here. This is about gun violence that has been motivated by white supremacy and misogyny, regardless of, the ethnic background, racial background of the individual. They are being influenced by and playing into misogyny and racism and white supremacy in this country. And I just think that we need to be really clear about that. The first person I called when I found out that the killer was, perceived to have a Muslim name and identity, I said, I'm going to take her lead. She's a feminist Muslim woman who's like taking on the Muslim community and holding them accountable for gender-based violence and, really have a RJ framework. And she said, I'm tired of apologizing for Muslim men,
good for her.
So we are following her lead and we're pivoting. And I hope your listeners will too, that when this conversation comes up and says, well, it was a Muslim shooter, let's pivot the conversation and talk about the systemic problem that we have in this country that has led to 7 mass shootings in 7 days.
That's right, and it's gun violence. Sung-Yeon, take a minute and tell our listeners about the organization, if you don't mind. I know you're the executive director. And I know that National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum does brilliant work. But talk about aspects of it, because some of the aspects of it are self-evident and certainly deserve the focus, just basically in terms of immigration status, in terms of pay equity for women, which is like not there. But some of the issues are coming in a bit under the radar, and I'd like to discuss them. Basically, among them, the issue of abortion and sex-selective abortion, and how that's impacting on the Asian American community. That would be helpful if you would talk about that for a minute.
Sure. So NAPAF is the only organization that sort of works at the national level to organize Asian American women and girls to build power for our own agency. It's a novel idea that we want to live in a world where we get to make decisions that's meaningful for ourselves and our families, and get to make determinations for our own bodies.
What a concept!
Yeah, it's so novel. It's kind of shocking. And so really, often I say, my daytime job, my full-time job is often, keeping our Asian American brothers and sisters and siblings accountable to the gender justice lens in our work, and then keeping our white siblings, in the reproductive rights and health and justice space accountable to the racial justice aspect of our work, right? Kind of in a nutshell what I do. And, I think that, this tragic incident in Atlanta has been really telling in terms of why the work that NAPAF does is so important. The bringing the intersectional perspective that these women weren't just Asian Americans who happened to be women who were murdered, or that they were women who happened to be Asian American that were murdered, but they were murdered because they were Asian American women.
Exactly.
Right. And you cannot separate the two. And I am, frankly, like you said, it was so funny when you said, we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same. I literally used that same phrase earlier on in an interview, saying they were asking, do you think this is a reckoning moment for racial justice for Asian Americans? And I said, well, it's a reckoning moment for racial justice and gender justice.
Yeah, what is the problem? Violence. What is there?
Right. I just cannot, I cannot understand why that concept is so difficult to understand. And I have been working tirelessly since the shooting on Tuesday night to really make sure that the full story of the women are out there. And Helen, I so appreciated your framing that this is femicide. And
That's
I
right.
just don't see enough of us going out there and saying that they were actually murdered because they were women.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And as important as the context and the reality we live in right now around coronavirus and all of that and the hate crimes that are spurring because of that. I mean, I've experienced some of that directly myself being a Korean American, but these women were not killed just because of the coronavirus and Trump's rhetoric around that. They were killed because Trump normalized misogyny when he became president.
That's right.
And even before that, but increased, danger because of Trump's normalization around misogyny. Then added to that the racialized aspect of what he did. And so this is what we're really trying to address. And as you were mentioning about sex-selective abortion, that's like, it's been a tactic from the right, the religious right, as they're thinking about what are all the ways that we could possibly restrict women's right to choose in creative ways, because Roe v. Wade is still the law of the land, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So they go after racial stereotyping, completely unfounded. And, NAPOP had commissioned a study along with the University of Chicago Law School, dispelling some of the narratives that are out there about Asian Americans, quote unquote, having sex preferences, right? So, back in the 2000s, in India and Korea and China, there were purported to be a disproportionate ratio of boys to girl babies. And so there was all this talk about the missing girls and all of these things. And literally lawmakers in the United States decided that, oh my goodness, these people are coming to our countries and bringing their quote unquote practices.
But they're not.
And we need to save these girl babies. Exactly. Well, and our research has shown actually that Korean Americans and Indian American women are having girl babies twice as many as their white counterparts.
I know. Right? I love that research because it's like all those little baby feminists are being born. I mean, that is very encouraging. Encouraging.
What was really scary was that, when they first came out with this, they went after some of these feminist organizations to say, this is what's happening. This is what Asian people are doing to their girl babies, and really couched it as this feminist approach to saving girl babies. Right.
Yeah.
And NAPOP had to really step in and really nuance the conversation and what was happening, and in fact do research of our own to dispel this myth.
Well, that's why your research is very important, though, because there were some feminists who were stopped up by that for a minute or two, if not longer.
Exactly. And one of the reasons that people are so shocked, about that what happened, to killing these women in Atlanta could be both tied to racism and to misogyny is the invisibility that Asian Americans and Asian American women have to fight. I mean, NAPOP was one of the organizations that stepped up when it was at Indiana, Sung-Yun, that, one of the first laws to prosecute women and hold them to, blame for even medical reasons for abortion.
Right.
The woman who was prosecuted in that was an Asian American woman, an Indian American woman, and NAPOP had to step up and bring attention to this. But this is the way that Asian Americans are used, sort of in this American, white supremacist culture and misogynistic culture. It's sort of keep them invisible and then trot them out when it's useful. And, one of the things I wanted to say that's also invisible in this is the role that the U.S. government and the U.S. military have played in the sexualization of and dehumanization of Asian American women,
bases.
By the role of the military bases, and they're creating these R&R zones that to U.S. soldiers, R&R support rape and run, and that's how so many of these GIs come back. And how do they look at Asian American women as the dehumanized objects? Right. So there's a complete role that the U.S. government and U.S. culture has played in this. Yeah. And they only see us when there's a mass killing, like in Atlanta, but it goes on all the time.
And I want to say that, as I've been reflecting, that Asian Americans in general, but especially women, are so invisibilized, especially those who are working in low wage jobs.
Yeah.
Yet they are they're so invisibilized as human beings, but they're so visibilized as sex objects, right?
Sure.
And that's essentially what got these women killed.
Yeah.
And we cannot lose sight of that,
No.
that these women had targets on their back because the racialized misogynistic history of this country, as you mentioned about the Page Act, and then the militarism of the United States, of Asian countries like my home country of Korea. And I think that it's really doing these women a disservice and dishonoring them to make it about one or the other. You know, they were really murdered, like I keep saying, because they were Asian American women.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, they were so dehumanized, you know, because of their class, their race, and gender.
Right. You know, the fact that they were working in a massage parlor. One had been a teacher back home. I think she was the woman who didn't want her son to know where she was working. I mean, your heart cracks about the everyday, calm, not complaining about pick yourself up and go on suffering that these women went through before he walked in and slaughtered them. When we talk about immigration and xenophobia, we should always be saying the very first group that ever was formally barred from this country were Asians. There it is. It's right there in the law.
Asian American women.
That's right. Because, of course, they would be prostitutes. And so that meant that men couldn't bring their wives, their families, you know. I mean, if women were barred. So that's the very first. That's like we speak of the original sin of this country being slavery. Maybe the original sin was Native American suffering. I have no idea. I'm not into competition of suffering. You know, but that was an original sin as well. That, you know, that's the very first time the framers, with all their faults, and boy, did they have faults, but the framers did have this crazy notion that they themselves were immigrants. But the very first legislation that really came out to say, nope, actually you're not, was the Page Act, and it specifically barred Asian women. I would point out that Asian women, two things, that the idea that there is an Asian American and Pacific Islander movement, which began after your expose on Vincent Chin, Helen, itself is a miracle, because no other ethnic group, oppressed group, links together so many mind-bogglingly different nationalities, cultures, ethnicities, languages. It just takes your breath away. And to build a movement from that is, as an organizer, hats off. It's no small thing. That's one thing. The other thing is that I think that white American women don't fully get the point that Asian women are the largest number of women on the planet, period. So if they're interested in winning this thing with the patriarchy, they got to get their act together.
Yeah, right. And, you know, as you started out saying, and Sung-Yeon mentioned that, you know, this was the 7th mass killing in 1 week.
Yeah.
And we know the news cycle is going to go away from this. And I hope all the listeners realize that this is not over. For Asian Americans, you know, we're really sort of, you know, this was a worst nightmare come true, but we know the nightmare is not over. And as we all know, you know, the lookalike people, the copycat people out there, and as the, you know, word of the pandemic is like, schools are going to open up, you know, Asian American parents and families are terrified of what this is going to mean for their kids.
Sure.
Because as Asian American women have been targeted, so have children and elderly. And so, you know, when people think about how they can be allies, there are stories about Asian American parents going to their school boards and saying to the to the schools and the principals, what can we do about this? And being told, well, that's not really that serious, is it? And just sort of moving on. It is serious. And so these are ways that people in their communities can really help support, fighting against this poison that is actually affecting everyone, not just Asian Americans, but our entire, democracy. Yeah. So I hope people will step up on that.
I hope people.
Yeah, and just to put some stories behind it, I'm a mom of a 6-year-old, so I know other moms. I've had friends who, even though there's an option to send your kids back hybrid, they're keeping them home because they're concerned about their children having to deal with racism. And before the pandemic, one of my friends who's Chinese, her daughter had an incident at school where these white boys bullied her and teased her about, Chinese people eat cats, and just was tormenting her, and the school didn't, and the school didn't take it seriously. And this is Chicago Public School. I'm not talking about Montana, middle of nowhere. I'm talking about Chicago Public School, one of the most diverse school districts in the country, right? Yeah. So and so I just, and then I was on a panel with another woman who shared a story about how apparently now it's so disturbing. Kids are playing this thing called coronavirus tag, and they're making East Asian kids be it.
Oh my God!
Because they're East Asian, right? And so her kid's coming home and saying, "Oh, I'm it because I'm Asian."
Oh,
it's awful. That's literally what this looks like on the ground.
Because this has been the safe thing to tromp all over. I mean, in other words, because it's invisible, because we can dismiss it, because because we can joke over it, the kung flu and all that crap. It just goes, it's not a real problem, or it's not that much of a problem, or, your hair is on fire. And we've got to change that. And maybe this is, maybe that the sacrifice of Sun Chung Park and Hyun Jung Grant and Sun Cha Kim and Young Yu, all of them, maybe not knowing that they were sacrificing their lives, but maybe it turns out to be something that we can sustain this time. The Black community sustained George Floyd into all of last summer and is pushing for it now. I read just this morning that I think it's Evanston, Illinois, has become the first city anywhere in this country to take a stand on reparations.
But can I tell you, I live next to Evanston. I live in Skokie, which is a suburb right next to Evanston.
Yeah.
And the city may have done that, but there's still plenty racist people.
Oh,
in the
God,
city.
yes.
So
no one's saying that's not the case.
And I think that's what's so pervasive and what kind of frustrates me about the solutions we're looking for, and especially related to the pandemic. All these, not the pandemic, but in response to the Atlanta shootings, all these mayors came out and said, we're going to increase police presence and law enforcement presence in Asian American communities. And I'm going, I don't feel any safer. And frankly, I refuse to believe that my safety has to come at the expense of over-policing of Black and brown men and women.
Exactly.
That's just not acceptable, right? So I think we need to really examine, where is the real solution? And I think, especially for your listeners and for us here, we can talk very candidly that, I am, frankly, there's a part of me that's really overwhelmed by what we're trying to tackle. And at the same time, I'm not willing to settle for, there's so many people willing to provide very Band-Aid solutions, and I'm just not willing to settle for that.
Time for that is long gone, if ever it existed.
Right.
It's just not possible anymore. The time for that was, it was gone by Vincent Chin. It was gone by the Page Act. it shouldn't have existed in the first place.
Right.
So the tragedy is there. And then now the question is not just what do we do, but how do we sustain what do we do, and how do we build what do we do? I'm now of an age and a weariness that I cannot afford to weary Sung-yeon, that tells me I won't live to see any of the change I fought for. But that's a small and irrelevant thing, because it is tiny and minimal and inconsequential and insufficient. Mostly, that's the word I'm after. As it is, it still is something. And as long as we say not enough, it's not, then we're on then we're on the right side. Then we're with the angels. As long as we settle, that way lies madness and death. Particularly since the planet itself is in danger. It's just so sad. It's so profoundly, simply sad that these women, many of whom were not young, paid with their lives.
Can I offer to say their Korean names, if you don't mind?
Yes.
A lot of these women who are doing low-wage work are probably taking on easy-to-pronounce names for American customers, and I really want to honor the names that their parents gave them when they were born, and their humanity. And so for me, it's really important that the Korean women are at least, and I'm doing my best to pronounce the Chinese names. But maybe, Helen, you can help me with the Chinese names.
I can do the Chinese names.
Perfect. So I'll read the Korean names, and Helen will read the Chinese names, and I can close out with Delina and Paul. And I'm going to do it actually in the way Koreans do it, which is last name first, and then their first name, and then I'm going to do an honorific, which is 님. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. Please do it.
Yep. 박순 자님, 현정 그랜트님, 김순자님, 유영애님.
Wow, that was beautiful. And the Chinese women were, and I will put their last name first as well, Tan Xiaojie and Feng Daoyou.
Delina, Ashley Yun, and Paul Andre Michaels.
Oh, you reduced me to tears. Thank you. Thank you for reading the names. Thank you for knowing the names and knowing how to pronounce them. And thank you for being here with your wisdom and your fury, which is beautiful and necessary and will pull us through today and every day. Thank you so much, Sung-yeon, and dearest Helen. Thank you always from my heart.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you for having us. This was an amazing conversation. It was very healing for me. Thank you so much.
And now for our final break, after which I'll return with some fighting words. The Women's Media Center, founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Simple facts, historical reality. That too can constitute fighting words. It's time for a little context, otherwise known as some history. By the 1830s, East Asian groups had begun immigrating to Hawaii, where American capitalists and missionaries had established plantations and settlements. Primarily from China, Japan, Korea, India, and the Philippines, these early migrants were predominantly contracted workers who were laborers on plantations. With the annexation of Hawaii by the United States in 1893, a large population of Asians lived in U.S. territory, and more would continue to immigrate. The first major wave to the continental U.S. occurred primarily on the West Coast during the California Gold Rush, starting in the 1850s. Most Chinese immigrants sought opportunity in the then young United States, hoping for wealth or even minimal wealth to send back to their families in China. As in Hawaii, many companies in California and elsewhere, including as far north as Massachusetts, sought Asian immigrants to fill an increasing demand for labor in gold mines, factories, and on the transcontinental railroad. Some plantation owners in the South sought Chinese labor as a cheap means to replace the free labor of slavery. In the 1860s and 1870s, nativist hostility to the presence of Asian laborers intensified, with the formation of organizations like the Asiatic Exclusion League. East Asian immigrants, particularly Chinese Americans, the majority of the mainland population, were regarded as the, quote, yellow peril, and suffered violence and much discrimination. Lynchings of Chinese were common, and large-scale attacks occurred. The most prominent act of violence at the time was the Rock Springs Massacre, in which a mob of white miners killed nearly 30 Chinese immigrants because they were accused of taking the white miners' jobs. In 1875, Congress passed the Page Act, P-A-G-E, the first restrictive immigration law of what would be many. This law recognized forced laborers from Asia as well as Asian women who would, quote, potentially engage in prostitution and therefore were undesirable people, close quote, who would henceforth be barred from entering the United States. In practice, the law was enforced to institute a near-complete exclusion of Chinese women from the United States, preventing male laborers from bringing their families with them or after them. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, named that, prohibited virtually all immigration from China, the first immigration law to do so on the basis of race or national origin. The law also prevented Chinese immigrants from naturalizing as U.S. citizens. The Geary Act of 1892 further, quote, required Chinese to register and secure a certificate as proof of their right to be in the United States, and if they sought to leave or re-enter, it threatened them with imprisonment or deportation as penalties. Still, Chinese immigrants fought to defend their existing rights, and they continued to pursue voting rights and citizenship. The Supreme Court in 1898 ruled that a person born in the U.S. to Chinese immigrant parents was a U.S. citizen at birth, and this decision established an important precedent in its interpretation of the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment. But anti-Asian hostility continued, exploding in the Pacific Coast race riots of 1907 in San Francisco, in Bellingham, Washington, and Vancouver, Canada. In the Bellingham riots, a mob of 400 to 500 white men attacked the homes of hundreds of South Asian immigrants, beating and driving them out of town, with over 400 more South Asians held in what was euphemistically termed protective custody by local authorities. These events encouraged the United States to pursue the 1907 so-called Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, wherein the Japanese government agreed to prohibit emigration to the United States. In practice, this meant that Japanese immigrants were barred unless they'd previously acquired property or were immediate relatives of existing immigrants. While overall Japanese immigration was sharply curtailed, the family reunification provision allowed for the gender gap among Japanese Americans to be reduced, including through so-called picture brides. As Koreans were Japanese colonial subjects at the time and could be issued Japanese passports, some Korean women also immigrated as family members and picture brides. The prohibitions of Chinese and Japanese immigration were consolidated during the exclusion era, and that exclusion was extended to Asia as a whole in the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917, prohibiting all immigration from a zone that encompassed parts of the Middle East, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia. The Immigration Act of 1924, also termed the Chinese Exclusion Act, introduced national origin quotas for the entire Eastern Hemisphere and barred the immigration of, quote, aliens ineligible for citizenship. This introduced a period of near complete exclusion of Asian immigration to the U.S. The act also formed the United States Border Patrol to take over duties of the United States Immigration Service Chinese Division. Existing Chinese immigrants were further excluded from agricultural labor by racial hostility, and as jobs in railroad construction declined, they increasingly moved into self-employment as laundry workers, store and restaurant owners, traders, merchants, and wage laborers, and they congregated in Chinatowns, established first in California and then across the country. Of the various Asian immigrant groups present in the United States after broad exclusion was introduced in 1917 and 1924, the South Asian population had the most severe gender gap. This led to many Punjabi Sikhs in California at that time to marry women of Mexican descent, avoiding anti-miscegenation laws and racial prejudice that prevented them from marrying into white communities. In 1922, the Supreme Court ruled that ethnic Japanese were not Caucasian and therefore did not meet the, quote, free white persons requirement, close quote, to naturalize, according to the Naturalization Act of 1790. In 1923, the court ruled that while South Asian Indians were considered Caucasian by contemporary racial anthropology, they were not seen as white and were therefore ineligible for naturalization. These cases confirmed that foreign-born Asian immigrants were legally excluded from naturalized citizenship on the basis of race. In addition to first-generation immigrants, whose permanent ineligibility for citizenship curtailed their civil and political rights, second-generation Asian Americans, who formerly had birthright citizenship, continued to face segregation in schools, employment discrimination, and prohibitions on property and business ownership. The most severe discrimination against Asian Americans, of course, occurred during the height of World War II, when, after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered 110,000 to 120,000 Japanese Americans, primarily on the West Coast, to be incarcerated in internment camps, concentration camps, between 1942 and 1946. While roughly a third of those people interned were Issei, first-generation immigrants, who were ineligible for citizenship, the vast majority were Nisei or Sansei, second- and third-generation citizens by birth. After the Second World War, U.S. immigration policy underwent significant change. In 1943, the Magnuson Act ended 62 years of Chinese exclusion, providing for a quota of 105 persons to immigrate each year and permitting the Chinese present in the U.S. to naturalize. But despite these provisions, the Act consolidated the prohibition of property or business ownership by Chinese Americans. This wave of reform eventually did lead to the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952, which repealed the remnants of the Free White Persons restriction of the 1790 Naturalization Act, permitting Asian and other non-white immigrants to become naturalized citizens. However, this act retained the quota system that effectively banned nearly all immigration from Asia except for small annual quotas. Its primary exception to the quota system was family reunification provisions for U.S. citizens. Now, there are certain dates that pop out at you and that I'm going to share with you, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. In 1854, People versus Hall, the California Supreme Court, denied the rights of Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans to testify against white citizens. In 1862, California imposed a tax of $2.50 a month on every Chinese man. In 1865, the Central Pacific Railroad Company recruited Chinese workers for the Transcontinental Railroad from California to Utah. Many workers are killed or injured in the harsh conditions blasting through difficult mountain terrain. In 1887, robbers killed 31 Chinese miners in Snake River, Oregon, following on the 1886 Rock Springs Massacre. In 1913, California bans Japanese immigrants from purchasing land. In 1927, in the infamous case of Lum versus Rice, the Supreme Court found that states possess the right to define a Chinese student as non-white for the purpose of segregating them in public schools. In 1942, after FDR signed the Executive Order 9066, ordering internment of Japanese Americans, Japanese American soldiers, within a year from Hawaii, joined the U.S. Army 100th Battalion and arrived in Europe. In 1944, the U.S. Army 100th merged with the all-volunteer Asian Americans of Japanese descent 442nd Regimental Combat Team. In 1945, that combat team was awarded 18,143 decorations, including 9,486 Purple Hearts, becoming the highest decorated military unit in U.S. history. In 1965, Patsy Mink of Hawaii becomes the first woman of color elected to Congress, and in 1972, she co-authors and sponsors the Title IX Amendment of the Higher Education Act and gets it passed on June 23rd about the prohibition of gender discrimination in the U.S. education system or other federally funded institutions. She also became the first Asian American woman to run for President of the United States. In 1982, Vincent Chin, a Chinese American, was beaten to death in Highland Park, Michigan, near Detroit. His murder became a rallying point for Asian Americans and the beginning of a pan-ethnic Asian American movement. In 2021, Kamala Harris was sworn in as the first Asian American, African American, Indian American, and female Vice President of the United States of America. It's been a long road getting to this place, and clearly we are nowhere near done yet, not with laying the road or with traveling on it. So please remember Sun Yen's and Helen's profoundly moving reading of the women's names. Remember. Those are my fighting words. Add yours on Twitter. And remember to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag #FightingWords. That's our show for this week. We'll be on hiatus next week, but then right back here. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and now Instagram at @TheRobinMorgan, and you can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book of poems, Dark Matter, and my brand new novel, Parallax, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer of this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.